Picture this. An entire species floating through space with nowhere to call home. The Kethmori looked like living crystals, their bodies naturally soaking up energy from everything around them. Pretty cool, right? Well, not if you're trying to dock at their space station. Every time these guys showed up, lights went out, computers crashed, and people started feeling drained. Literally. Their own sun had gone supernova 300 years ago, and they'd been wandering ever since, getting turned away from every port in the galaxy. Now, let me paint you a better picture of what we're dealing with here. Imagine beings that look like they're carved from pure gemstone, but they're alive and breathing. The Kethmori stood about 7 feet tall, their bodies shifting between deep blues and brilliant purples depending on how much energy they were absorbing. When they walked, tiny sparks would dance across their crystalline skin, creating this mesmerizing light show that was honestly beautiful to watch. But here's the kicker. They couldn't turn it off. These weren't your typical space nomads choosing the wandering life. 3 centuries back, their home star decided to throw the ultimate tantrum. Scientists called it a stellar expansion event, but the Kethmori just called it the end of everything they'd ever known. Their planet, their cities, their entire civilization, all of it got swallowed up when their sun grew to hundreds of times its original size. The lucky ones, and we're talking maybe 200,000 survivors out of billions, managed to escape in whatever ships they could cobble together. But surviving was just the beginning of their problems. See, the Kethmori had evolved on a world where energy was abundant. Their bodies naturally pulled power from their surroundings like living sponges. Back home, this wasn't an issue. Their technology was built around this trait. But out in the wider galaxy, it was a disaster waiting to happen every single time. Picture trying to refuel your ship while a Kethmori family was nearby. Your fuel pumps would slow to a crawl. Your navigation systems would start glitching. Even the coffee maker in the crew quarters would barely work. And if you were unlucky enough to spend a few hours near them, you'd start feeling like you hadn't slept in days. It wasn't malicious. They literally couldn't help it. It was just how their biology worked. The first few decades weren't too bad. The galaxy was big, and there were plenty of empty systems where they could park their fleet and try to repair their aging ships. But as word spread about the energy vampires, as some cruel species started calling them, doors began slamming shut. Trade stations would refuse them docking privileges. Planets would turn away their diplomatic missions before they even entered orbit. Some systems went as far as setting up early warning networks to track Kethmori movements and alert everyone to steer clear. What made it worse was that these beings were genuinely peaceful. They weren't conquerors or pirates. They just wanted a place to rebuild their lives. But when your very presence causes billion-credit space stations to experience power failures, people tend to see you as more trouble than you're worth. The Kethmori learned to keep their distance, making do with quick supply runs at automated trading posts where their energy absorption wouldn't affect anyone directly. Their fleet was a sight that would break your heart if you really looked at it. Ships that were once marvels of crystal-based engineering now held together with salvage parts and desperate hope. Some vessels had been cannibalizing others just to keep the essential systems running. Every year, they'd lose another ship to complete system failure, and with it, hundreds more of their dwindling population. The younger Kethmori, those born during the long journey, had never seen a planet they could call home. They grew up in cramped corridors and recycled air, listening to elders tell stories of crystal cities that caught starlight and turned it into song. These kids knew nothing but rejection and constant movement, always being told to pack up and move along because they weren't wanted. By the time our story really begins, the Kethmori had been reduced to maybe 50,000 survivors spread across a dozen barely functioning ships. They'd gone from being one of the galaxy's most innovative civilizations to being treated like cosmic pariahs. Their scientists, once renowned for their work with energy manipulation, were now spending all their time just trying to keep life support systems online. And that's where humanity comes into the picture. Because while the rest of the galaxy saw a problem that needed to be avoided, we humans have this weird habit of seeing problems as puzzles waiting to be solved. The Galactic Confederation finally had enough. After months of debate, they basically told the Kethmori, "Thanks, but no thanks." Sure, These crystal beings were peaceful as anything, but nobody wanted their power grids failing every time they came to visit. The vote wasn't even close. The Keth Mori could pass through space, but settling down? Forget about it. They were sentenced to drift forever while their ancient ships slowly fell apart around them. Now, you have to understand how big of a deal this decision was. The Galactic Confederation didn't just represent a few planets. We're talking about over 3,000 civilizations spread across 47 different star systems. These weren't your typical space bullies either. The Confederation prided itself on being progressive, inclusive, the kind of organization that welcomed refugees with open arms. They had entire departments dedicated to helping displaced species find new homes. But the Keth Mori? They were different. They were the first species that literally couldn't coexist with modern galactic infrastructure without causing massive headaches. The debates went on for 8 solid months. Picture the biggest, most expensive conference room you've ever seen. Then multiply that by about 1,000. Representatives from every major species sat in a massive circular chamber that could have fit a small city inside it. The Altari delegates, with their pale blue skin and logical minds, kept pulling up economic reports showing billions of credits in damages. The insectoid Vextar buzzed angrily about how their hive ships couldn't function properly when Keth Mori vessels were nearby. Even the usually calm ethereals, those floating energy beings who rarely got involved in politics, expressed concerns about interference with their natural forms. But here's what really got to everyone. The Keth Mori weren't causing these problems on purpose. During the hearings, their representatives would stand there in their crystalline bodies, light dancing across their surfaces, genuinely apologizing for something they couldn't control. It was like watching someone apologize for breathing too loudly. You felt bad for them, but that didn't make the problem go away. The Confederation had tried everything they could think of. They'd funded research into containment suits that might block the energy absorption. Scientists from 12 different species worked for 2 years trying to develop some kind of shielding technology. They tested everything from magnetic fields to exotic matter barriers. Nothing worked. The Keth Mori's energy absorption was too fundamental to their biology. It was like trying to stop fish from swimming or birds from flying. The economic impact was staggering. Every time a Keth Mori ship docked at a station, repair crews had to spend days fixing damaged systems. Insurance companies started adding special clauses to their policies. Trade routes got rerouted to avoid areas where the Keth Mori fleet might be passing through. Some smaller trading posts had to shut down completely after a single visit left their power systems fried beyond repair. But the real heartbreaker was watching what this did to individual lives. Picture a Confederation citizen who'd saved up for years to take their family on a vacation cruise. Now imagine that cruise ship breaking down in the middle of space because they passed too close to a Keth Mori vessel. Life support flickering on and off. Food spoiling because the refrigeration units couldn't maintain power. Kids crying because the entertainment systems crashed. These stories made headlines across the galaxy, and public opinion started turning hard against the crystal beings. The final vote wasn't even close. Out of 3,247 voting delegates, only 127 voted to allow Keth Mori settlement rights. Even species that had never interacted with them directly voted for ban, worried about what might happen if these energy-draining refugees ended up in their space. The Confederation's final ruling was delivered with all the ceremony and politeness they could muster. The Keth Mori would be granted humanitarian passage rights through Confederation space. They could buy supplies at automated trading posts. They could receive emergency medical assistance. But permanent settlement? Absolutely not. No planet, no space station, no orbital habitat would be required to accept them as residents. The Keth Mori delegation received this news with the kind of quiet dignity that made the whole thing even more tragic. Their lead representative, an elderly crystal being whose body had turned almost white with age, simply nodded and thanked the Confederation for their consideration. No anger, no protest, no dramatic speeches. Just acceptance of a fate that meant their species would continue drifting through space until their ships finally gave out completely. And that's exactly what they did. They packed up their few belongings, powered down their temporary habitats, and headed back to their fleet. Within weeks, They were moving again, a convoy of dying ships carrying the last remnants of a once great civilization into the empty darkness between stars. The galaxy had spoken. The Keth Mori were someone else's problem now. Too bad for them. Nobody else wanted to deal with it either. Then along comes Captain Tom Blake in the human ship Defiance. Most species would have kept their distance, followed protocol, you know the drill. But Tom, he pulls up right next to the Keth Mori fleet and starts chatting. When they explained their whole sad story, expecting another rejection, Tom had a completely different reaction. While the galaxy saw walking power outages, he saw something else entirely, living, breathing energy sources just waiting to be partnered with. Now, Tom Blake wasn't your typical space captain. This guy had spent 15 years hauling cargo through the roughest parts of the galaxy, places where other species wouldn't dare venture. He'd fix his ship with duct tape and pure stubbornness more times than he could count. His crew used a joke that Tom could make a broken coffee machine run a warp drive if he put his mind to it. The point is, when this man saw a problem, he didn't see an obstacle. He saw a puzzle that needed solving. The Defiance itself was pretty much the perfect example of human engineering philosophy. It wasn't the prettiest ship in the fleet, and it definitely wasn't the most advanced. But it was tough, adaptable, and had been modified so many times that the original blueprints were basically useless. Tom's crew had installed backup systems for backup systems, and when those failed, they jury-rigged something from spare parts and coffee grounds. This was the kind of ship that could keep flying even when half its systems were down. So when Tom's navigation officer picked up the Keth Mori fleet on long-range sensors, the standard procedure would have been to plot a course around them, give them plenty of space, maybe send a polite greeting from a safe distance, and move on. That's what the Confederation protocols recommended. That's what any sensible captain would do. But Tom looked at those sensor readings and saw something that made him curious. Here was this massive convoy of ships, clearly struggling to maintain formation, broadcasting distress signals in 17 different languages. His tactical officer was already suggesting they maintain distance. After all, everyone knew about the Keth Mori by now. The stories had spread through every spaceport and trading station in human space. Instead of turning away, Tom did something that would have given Confederation officials heart attacks. He ordered his helmsman to plot an intercept course. Not just close enough to offer assistance from a safe distance, but close enough to actually dock if needed. His crew thought he'd lost his mind. The chief engineer started running diagnostics on every system they had, expecting power failures any minute. When the Defiance pulled alongside the lead Keth Mori vessel, something interesting happened. Yeah, their lights flickered a bit, and the coffee maker in the galley started acting up, but the ship kept running. The fusion reactor hummed along just fine. The navigation computers stayed online. Tom's crew realized that all those backup systems and redundant power supplies they'd installed over the years were actually handling the energy drain pretty well. The conversation that followed was unlike anything in recorded galactic history. Most first contacts with the Keth Mori went the same way. Polite greetings, quick explanations about their situation, and then awkward goodbyes as the other species found excuses to leave. But Tom listened to their story with the kind of attention you'd give to a fascinating technical manual. The Keth Mori representative, a being whose crystal body shifted from deep purple to worried orange as they spoke, laid out their entire history, the loss of their homeworld, 3 centuries of wandering, the Confederation's rejection, the slow death of their fleet. They explained it all with the weary patience of people who told this story 1,000 times, always expecting the same result. But Tom's reaction was completely different. While they were talking about their energy absorption as this terrible curse that made them unwelcome everywhere, Tom was doing math in his head. He was thinking about power generation, about energy distribution, about all the ways human technology could adapt to work with this trait instead of against it. See, humans had always been the scrappy underdogs of the galaxy. We didn't have the advanced technology of the Altari or the natural psychic abilities of the Ethereals. What we had was this weird talent for taking broken things and making them work, for finding opportunities where everyone else saw problems. Tom started asking questions that caught the Keth Mori completely off guard. Instead of wanting to know how to avoid their energy absorption, he wanted to know exactly how it worked. Could they control the rate of absorption? Was there a maximum amount they could handle? What happened to all that energy once they absorbed it? Could they redirect it somehow? The crystal beings had never been asked these questions before. For 300 years, every conversation had been about minimizing their impact, containing their abilities, working around their biology. Here was the first person who seemed genuinely interested in understanding their abilities as potential assets rather than inevitable problems. That's when Tom made the offer that would change everything. Instead of telling them to move along like everyone else, he invited them to follow the Defiance back to human space, not as refugees looking for charity, but as potential partners in the biggest energy revolution the galaxy had ever seen. What happened next was pure human stubbornness at its finest. Instead of running away from the problem, our engineers rolled up their sleeves and got to work. They redesigned entire colonies around Kethmori's settlements, turning that energy drain into energy gain. Yeah, some humans got tired being around them, but we figured out how to work with it. We even discovered that small doses actually boosted brain function. Go figure. When the first Kethmori ships arrived at New Tasmania, a human mining colony on the edge of our space, the local governor nearly had a panic attack. Here were these crystal beings that everyone in the galaxy was afraid of, and Captain Tom Blake was asking for permission to let them set up permanent residence. The colony's chief engineer, a woman named Beth Rodriguez, was the first to step up and say, "Let's see what we're dealing with." Beth had spent 20 years keeping mining equipment running in conditions that would make other species cry. Dust storms that could strip paint off metal, temperature swings that cracked steel, and power fluctuations that fried sensitive electronics on a daily basis. When she heard about beings who naturally absorbed energy, her first thought wasn't, "Oh no, our power grid." It was, "How do we harness this?" The early experiments were pretty rough. Not gonna lie, they started small, setting up a temporary Kethmori camp about 2 miles from the main colony. Even at that distance, the settlement's power grid started acting weird. Lights would dim randomly, the water recycling plant would hiccup, and the communication array kept cutting out during important calls to Earth. Most colonists wanted to send the crystal beings packing before things got worse. But Beth and her team saw patterns in the chaos. The power fluctuations weren't random. They followed specific cycles based on how many Kethmori were active and what they were doing. When the crystal beings were resting, energy drain was minimal. When they were excited or working on something, the absorption spiked dramatically. It was like having a variable load on their power systems, and variable loads could be managed. That's when human engineering creativity really kicked in. Instead of fighting the energy drain, they decided to work with it. The team started redesigning their power distribution network from the ground up. They installed massive capacitor banks that could store energy during low drain periods and release it when the Kethmori were more active. They created redundant power loops that could reroute electricity around areas of high absorption. The breakthrough came when they realized the Kethmori weren't just taking energy, they were processing it. The crystal beings could absorb chaotic, dirty power and somehow clean it up inside their bodies before releasing it back into their environment. It was like having living power conditioners scattered throughout the colony. Within 6 months, New Tasmania had the most stable power grid in human space. The constant energy cycling was actually filtering out electrical noise and power surges that had plagued the mining equipment for years. Machines that used to break down weekly were running smoothly for months at a time. Production efficiency shot up by 30% almost overnight. But the real surprise came from the human colonists themselves. The ones who worked closest to the Kethmori settlements started reporting something weird. After the initial fatigue wore off, and it usually took about 2 weeks for humans to adapt, people began feeling sharper, more focused. Workers were solving problems faster, making fewer mistakes, coming up with innovations that impressed even the crystal beings. Dr. Kevin Park, the colony's medical officer, started running tests and discovered something amazing. The low-level energy interaction with the Kethmori was somehow stimulating human neural activity. It wasn't making people smarter exactly, but it was making their brains work more efficiently. Reaction times improved, memory recall got better, and creative thinking went through the roof. Word about New Tasmania's success spread through human space like wildfire. Other colonies started volunteering to host Kethmori refugees, not out of charity, but because they wanted to get in on these benefits. Engineers from across human territory showed up to study the hybrid settlements and figure out how to replicate the success. The Kethmori, meanwhile, were experiencing something they hadn't felt in 3 centuries: hope. For the first time since losing their homeworld, they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. Human engineers worked alongside crystal technicians to develop new technologies that neither species could have created alone. The Kethmori's natural ability to manipulate energy combined with human adaptability was producing innovations that made the rest of the galaxy take notice. Of course, not every experiment worked perfectly. There were power plant explosions, some spectacular equipment failures, and more than a few colonists who couldn't adapt to living near the crystal beings. But humans have this weird habit of learning from disasters and trying again with better safety protocols. The key was that humans never saw the Kethmori as a problem to be solved or a burden to be carried. We saw them as partners with unique abilities that complemented our own. Instead of trying to change them or contain them, we changed ourselves and our technology to work better together. That's just how humans roll. Give us a challenge that everyone else says is impossible, and we'll find 3 different ways to turn it into an advantage. Fast forward 5 years, and the Human-Kethmori partnership was producing tech that made the rest of the galaxy's jaws drop. When the Confederation finally paid attention, they found that humanity hadn't just solved the Kethmori problem. We created one of the most advanced civilizations in known space. Those crystal beings the galaxy had written off as a lost cause, they were thriving in dozens of human systems, their kids growing up in a society that actually wanted them around. Sometimes the best solutions come from the species crazy enough to try. The transformation was absolutely mind-blowing. Remember New Tasmania, that little mining colony where this whole thing started? It had become the energy capital of human space. The hybrid power systems they developed with the Kethmori were producing clean, unlimited energy at a fraction of the cost of traditional fusion reactors. Other species were literally lining up to buy human energy technology, the same tech they refused to help develop when they kicked the crystal beings out of their space. But the energy revolution was just the beginning. The real game changer came when human and Kethmori scientists started working together on faster-than-light travel. See, the Kethmori had always understood energy manipulation in ways that other species couldn't grasp. They could feel the flow of power through space itself, detecting currents and patterns that human instruments couldn't even measure. When our engineers combined this natural ability with human innovation, they cracked problems that had stumped galactic scientists for centuries. The new ships coming out of human Kethmori shipyards could travel twice as fast as anything else in the galaxy while using half the fuel. The crystal beings would literally guide the ships through the most efficient energy pathways in space, like cosmic navigators reading currents that nobody else knew existed. Trade routes that used to take months now took weeks. Communication networks that relied on these ships could send messages across the galaxy in record time, and the living conditions? Incredible. The joint colonies had become showcases of what cooperation could achieve. Instead of the sterile artificial environments most species built, human Kethmori settlements felt alive. The crystal beings' natural energy cycles created these amazing light displays that turned entire cities into works of art. Children of both species grew up together, human kids learning to work with energy in ways their parents never imagined, while young Kethmori discovered human creativity and problem-solving techniques. The medical breakthroughs were revolutionary, too. Remember how humans got smarter working near the crystal beings? Well, 5 years of research had turned that accidental discovery into targeted treatments. Human doctors and Kethmori healers developed therapies that could help people recover from brain injuries, boost learning abilities, and even slow down aging. The waiting list for treatment at human Kethmori medical centers stretched across multiple star systems. But here's what really got the galaxy's attention: the defense capabilities. When pirates tried to raid one of the joint colonies, they got the shock of their lives. The Kethmori could drain power from attacking ships faster than their generators could replace it. Meanwhile, human defensive systems, supercharged by crystal energy manipulation, could track and target threats with impossible accuracy. The raid was over in minutes, with the pirates' ships dead in space and completely helpless. Word of that incident spread fast. Suddenly, every species that had voted to reject the Keth Mori was sending diplomatic missions to human space, wanting to discuss mutual cooperation opportunities. The same politicians who had called the crystal beings a galactic threat were now offering trade deals and alliance proposals. The irony was delicious. The Confederation had spent 8 months debating how to get rid of the Keth Mori, and now they were spending twice as long trying to figure out how to get access to human Keth Mori technology. Some of the more desperate species were even offering to buy the crystal being's services at premium rates, completely missing the point that this was a partnership, not a business transaction. The young Keth Mori were the real success story, though. Kids who'd been born during those dark centuries of wandering were now growing up as full citizens of thriving worlds. They attended human schools, played on mixed sports teams, and dreamed about careers in engineering or exploration instead of just survival. Some of them had never even seen the old refugee ships their parents had lived on, except in museums dedicated to remembering how far they'd all come together. The galaxy's reaction ranged from embarrassment to outright envy. Here were 2 species that had turned rejection into the foundation for unprecedented advancement. The Confederation kept sending study groups to try and understand how the partnership worked, but they kept missing the essential ingredient: genuine acceptance and cooperation instead of just tolerance. Captain Tom Blake, now an admiral in the joint human Keth Mori fleet, liked to joke that the galaxy's biggest mistake was giving humanity a problem they were too stubborn to walk away from. But really, it went deeper than stubbornness. Humans had looked at the Keth Mori and seen potential partners instead of inconvenient refugees. We'd chosen cooperation over fear, innovation over isolation, and that choice had transformed both species into something greater than either could have become alone. Sometimes the best solutions really do come from the species crazy enough to try when everyone else has given up.